I'm going to talk a little bit about a project, or quite a lot about a project that I just finished that was funded by AHDB Dairy and also in collaboration with the Dairy Council. And I'm going to try and tie in some of the findings from that study with a quite limited body of evidence that's been done in this area as well to come up with an overall outlook for dairy as part of a sustainable diet. So the global population, which is 7 billion people today, is going to increase by just over 9 billion people by 2050. Now, supplying a growing population with sufficient food to meet energy as well as micronutrient needs is perhaps one of the world's greatest challenges. In addition to this, there is a greater demand, global demand for milk and dairy products, also meat products, and this is particularly in developing countries such as India, China, and also South America. So this further adds to this global problem. Now, any sort of evidence or analysis looking at environmental sustainability of dairy products needs to take into account the nutritional and health contribution of dairy products. Dairy products are a rich source of a number of nutrients in the diet that we need, and that it is really a vital source of these nutrients. So any sort of product needs to take into account not only the environmental impact of dairy products, but also the nutritional and health impact. Financial cost of what we eat, our diets, is a huge factor in food choice. And this is why we also decided to include this in the project. So it's a modelling study, and I'll explain a little bit more about it now. So I created a predictive response model for adults in the UK. So it's based on consumption data of what we actually eat in the UK, and it's based on the National Diet and Nutrition Survey. So it's representative of a cross-section of the UK population. The financial data was done by simple online shopping, so it's really just the cost of food items at one point in time, but we felt that this was as accurate as we could possibly get. So really, one of the strengths of this project is that it's actually based on real sort of diets of what people are actually eating in the UK, and it's actually one of the first studies to do that. In addition to this, we also look at 5 different environmental factors. So I could say with quite a lot of confidence that there have been no other studies that have done this. Most studies only look at greenhouse gas emissions. It could possibly be because there's the most amount of data on greenhouse gas emissions. So the profile for the types of foods, ranging from the whole diet, is more complete, whereas it was a little bit patchy for land and water use, and also eutrophication and also acidification, but we had to do what we could with the data available. But this sort of project is really very much reliant on the quality of the data available. So in order to kind of estimate what people were eating in the UK, I separated the data into quartiles, so that's into 4. And they were based on from people who had low amounts of dairy, which is Q1, and all the way up to people who had quite high amounts of dairy in the diet, so Q4. So high and low amounts, they're really relative to this particular population. As I said, it is meant to be representative of the UK. So by doing this sort of separation of the data, we also found that some quite interesting sort of dietary habits, or dietary patterns as we call it. So low dairy consumers, they tended to be associated with what you might call a slightly more unhealthy diet. So sort of white bread, coated fish or fried fish, soft drinks, which is very interesting. So you could hypothesize that the low dairy consumers are replacing their milk intake with soft drinks, which obviously isn't ideal from a nutrition and health perspective. Whereas the high dairy consumers, they tended to have a dietary pattern that looked as if it was more healthy. So they actually had brown bread, high fiber breakfast cereals, more fruits, more vegetables, but they did have more cakes and biscuits. And this could actually be because of the way that the consumers are consuming milk, for example, a glass of milk with some biscuits. We found this quite interesting. I also looked at a dairy-free diet, so people didn't have any dairy whatsoever. It was a very small proportion of people in my data set, it was only 21. But nonetheless, I thought it would be interesting to see what type of pattern they had, and actually it was a different type of dietary pattern to the low dairy consumers. It was slightly more healthy, whole milk bread. They had more milk alternatives, which you may expect. These people are completely cutting out all their milk. They had eggs, chicken, turkey, and potatoes. So this table essentially shows the nutritional supply and adequacy of the 4 different dairy diets. So Q1 is the low dairy diet, and Q4 is the high dairy diet. And what you can see actually is that in a number of different nutrients, particularly riboflavin, vitamin B12, calcium, but also iodine, the high dairy diet did have significantly more supply of a number of these key nutrients. And it's likely that this is because this diet had more dairy in it. This diet also, the high dairy diet, also had more saturated fat. But as Anne has just very nicely presented, actually there's no detrimental effect of having saturated fat from dairy products. So in the UK, I'm sure you're all aware, we have nutrient recommendations. So this is certain levels of each nutrient that we need to get for optimum function and health and that sort of thing. And this is perhaps the most interesting way of looking at the data, because the high dairy diet could provide significantly more nutrients, but is that enough to have a healthy life and meet adequate intakes for that particular nutrient? So this is what this graph essentially shows. The red dotted line is, if the bar meets the red dotted line, it means that it meets 100% of the nutrient recommendations for that particular nutrient. So if you look at the low dairy diet, which is in the light blue, you can see that actually the low dairy diet doesn't meet nutrient recommendations for riboflavin, calcium, and is only just about meeting for iodine as well. Whereas in contrast, the high dairy diet is way above nutrient recommendations for these nutrients. So again, I found this dairy-free dietary pattern very interesting. So I did a quick analysis to see what the contribution of nutrients would be to the recommended nutrient intakes from these dairy-free diets. And what you can see in the yellow, which is the males, actually is way below nutrient recommendations for calcium, iodine, and riboflavin. And this is even worse in females. And a particular problem is actually iodine deficiency in women, especially women of childbearing age, because iodine deficiency during pregnancy has been associated with reduced cognitive outcomes in the offspring. There has been some evidence to suggest that this is becoming a problem in the UK. And milk is really one of the best sources for iodine. So I also thought, I wonder what would happen if I replaced all the liquid milk in the diet with soy milk, as people sometimes do. And what you can see is actually this type of diet didn't meet nutrient recommendations for calcium. It was quite a lot below. But this was actually an unfortified soy milk. But when I did the analysis again, with the fortified soy milk, it did meet nutrient recommendations for calcium. So in terms of environmental impact, what you can see here is a graph showing the environmental impact of the different dairy-containing diets. So in brown, we have the current UK average adult sort of environmental impact. And in the white, you have the low dairy diet, and in the blue, you have the high dairy diet. And actually, the high dairy diet did have a higher overall environmental impact. For example, it had significantly higher eutrophication, land use, total water use, and the land use and total water use were almost linear going from the low dairy diet to the high dairy diet. And this is possibly what you would expect. Acidification, the high dairy diet was higher, but it wasn't significantly different, and the same with greenhouse gas emissions. However, it's important to bear in mind that these people were not just consuming dairy products. They were eating all sorts of, they were eating a normal diet, consisting of loads of other foods that also contributed to that environmental impact. And of course, different foods have different environmental impacts. So in the high dairy diets, you can see I've circled tea, coffee and water, alcohol, and then dairy, and they're really the top three that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So in terms of financial cost of the different diets, the high dairy diet was actually significantly cheaper compared to the low dairy diet in overall cost. But there is also a different way of looking at this, and this is per nutrient. So if you look at the graph on the left, what you can see is in the white bar is the dairy-free diet, and then next to it, the light blue, is the low dairy diet. Actually, the cost per individual nutrient, so the amount of CO2 equivalents per cost of calcium, for example, is higher for the dairy-free and the low dairy diets compared to the high. And this is because, obviously, the high dairy diet has more nutrients in it. And this was exactly the same when we looked at the financial cost of the different diets. So I think it's really important to bear in mind the different ways you can actually interpret and look at the data and come out with, slightly different meanings. And I think this particular way of looking at it really does bring in the aspect of the nutritional value of milk and dairy products. So overall, the findings from this modelling study showed that excluding dairy products or having a diet that's low in dairy products, particularly milk, may have important nutritional consequences in adults. And this is just in adults, it could be even worse in children. Dietary patterns representative of the current UK adults that are free or low in dairy products provide higher financial costs and CO2 equivalents per nutrient compared with those that are high in dairy. And this type of model or this type of statistical analysis could be used for so many different scenarios. This is really just a snapshot of what could be done with the data. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on what other people have done, and this was really one of the first studies which was done in 2012 to look at the whole concept of diet and sustainability. And this was done by Jenny McDermott. They used a slightly different sort of mathematical model. They used linear programming. And what they found was a 36% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by optimizing existing UK food groups. So they did use actual UK data. And the interesting part with this is actually this diet did meet 100% of nutrient recommendations. So they restricted it. They wanted to have a diet that reduced CO2 emissions, but at the same time met 100% of nutrient recommendations. And the first time they ran this model, it came out with 7 food items. And I'm not sure if anybody has a diet that only consists of 7 food items. So it's really important with this type of work that the types of diets that are developed are also accepted to consumers. And also this diet was created with 36% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and it did not eliminate meat or dairy products. So many of the early studies had a very reductionist approach where they would just look at diets that completely had no dairy and no meat in, which is not really realistic. So this is another study. This was done in Denmark, and they looked at the New Nordic diet, and it showed that it has 35% less global warming potential compared to the average Danish diet. And it also had 30% less socioeconomic costs. And this diet, again, did have a slight reduction in dairy products. Actually, it had a slight increase in dairy products, but did reduce beef, for example. So it just shows that it's actually possible to reduce the sort of greenhouse gas emissions and environmental impact without having to reduce the amount of milk or dairy products in the diet. So this is one of the also quite early studies that I thought would be quite interesting to show. They took this work in a slightly different direction, and they wanted to know what the health outcomes would be. So in terms of mortality and what we died of, so whether it would be cardiovascular disease or cancer, and whether sustainable diets would have a differential effect on sort of death. So they took a different approach in that they created the scenarios. So these were hypothetical scenarios. So there may have been no people at all consuming these types of diets. And the first scenario was a 50% reduction in meat and dairy, balanced with an increase in plant foods. The second one was a shift from red meat to white meat, with no overall reduction. And the third one was a 50% reduction in white meat, balanced with an increase in plant foods. And what you can see is actually scenario 1 prevents the most amount of deaths, which is pretty interesting. But I do think that this study does have a number of flaws, really, and this type of work really needs to be repeated in a more sort of up-to-date population with real dietary patterns. So obviously we're all aware of this issue of overconsumption, obesity. It's also related to environmental sustainability. And what this quite large scatter plot shows is quite a nice relationship between energy intake and also greenhouse gas emissions. So the more you eat, the likelihood of your personal and environmental sort of impact being higher. So instead of perhaps targeting so much individual food groups such as dairy, we could also tackle the issue of obesity, which would also go a long way in helping improve environmental sustainability for the future. So when evaluating the position of dairy in the diet, it should really take into account both nutritional and environmental factors. Our study is really the first in the UK to evaluate sort of this role of dairy as part of a sustainable diet. We need a lot more. We need a lot more in different populations within the UK. We need better data. We need shared data. At the moment, each research group working in this area have their own calculated values for greenhouse gas emissions that they have plucked out of the literature available, which is very limited. I think we really need to have sort of a joint database of all the environmental values for across the food chain that can be shared openly, and I think that will go a really long way in getting really robust evidence in this area, which is what's really needed. So models that optimize total diets rather than looking at individual foods, so like the last example I showed, where they just replace 50% of meat and dairy with plant-based foods, it's not really the way forward in my opinion. And the preferred approach is really trying to look at total diets, realistic diet patterns of what people are actually eating. I also think future studies in this area should look at affordability, food safety and taste. Because we can come up with a fantastic diet that reduces 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, but if nobody wants to actually eat it, well, we can't make any dietary change in that area. So I worked together with ADAS, who collected all the environmental data. I'm a nutritionist, so this was not my expert area, but they were very good. And we also worked with RAND Europe, who did a lot of the sort of project management. And then my team at Reading are Ian Gibbons and Julie Upgrove. And thank you very much.